people do not like the idea instinctively that any rich guy can buy information showing where they go, where they work, where they worship their religion, where they seek healthcare, where their children go during the day, when they're home, when they're not home. And that's exactly what this industry is facilitating. So we saw a window there and we seized on it.
Good evening and welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Frédéric Rigolo, the Executive Director. Tonight, we are exploring the relationship between privacy, power, and the right to dissent. At a moment when personal data is being collected, bought, and used in ways most people never see, we are asking a simple and urgent question. Can democracy survive the data economy? To answer this question, we are fortunate to be joined by two leading defenders of digital rights. Cindy Cohn, Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. She just released her memoir, Privacy Defender, My 30 Years Fight Against Digital Surveillance. And she is an internationally renowned authority on digital privacy and surveillance, free speech, intellectual property, artificial intelligence, and other topics at the intersection of technology and law. Kade Crockford is the director of the Technology and Justice Program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Kade writes, researches, organizes, lobbies, and advocates to ensure that privacy and civil liberties law keeps pace with new technology, with a focus on how systems of surveillance and control impact not just society in general, but their primary targets, people of color, Muslim, immigrant, and dissidents. And guiding our conversation tonight is Amba Kak. She is a co-executive director of the AI Now Institute. She leads research and policy work on artificial intelligence and concentrated power. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Amba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here in conversation with two people who are both inspirations and also fellow travelers. I'm going to start with some context setting and then get into the conversation. So this is a conversation about privacy, power, dissent. And I think it's worth saying at the outset that it's been a long and a hard-fought battle to rescue public understandings of privacy from these narrow definitions that reduce it to the domain of individual choices and, the opaque, largely unreadable privacy policies, or that relegate privacy to as a concern of the elite or anyone that has something to hide. And instead, I think in the year 2026, we finally reached the point where it is both intuitive and I would argue visceral for most people that privacy is about power, and that our responses to it, our responses to protect it, to defend it, must also be collective and structural in ways that help rebalance power. So privacy, it gives us a defensive shield to protect our freedoms. The freedom not to be watched is, I guess, the most obvious one, but also not to be nudged or pushed towards someone else's goals. Equally, I really resonate with sort of affirmative definitions of privacy as the ability to author our own lives, to form authentic relationships, to develop our sense of right and wrong and what a good life means for any of us. And key to all of this is the ability to dissent, right? The ability to make these normative positions that we might hold matter and hopefully shape the world in that direction. And I work in the field of AI policy, and it's really interesting how privacy is now being recast as an economic justice issue, as anxieties about AI-related job loss are boiling over. We're seeing whether it's customer service representatives or nurses or Hollywood body doubles, right? You're seeing the pushback against surveillance of workflows, of bodies, as a means to automation or potentially to devaluation of people's work. We have, over the last few years, seen privacy become a core reproductive justice issue, for people searching for healthcare whose data might be sold in ways that make them vulnerable to criminal prosecution, for activists whose location histories, places them at protests before charges are filed, for young people whose faces, all of us, but for young people, maybe most concerningly, whose faces are getting scraped into databases they never consented to, one that, future people that have power over them, police, landlords, employers, can query for decades. And then finally, I think whether it was the kind of Doge uh, revelations, let's call it that, or the ICE uprising, I think in the last few years, we have also seen the public really unify in the analysis of the fact that these data grabs are really power grabs, and that the stakes are higher than they've ever been. So in sum, the landscape is ripe for energizing and for expanding the movement that Kade and Cindy and I and many others have been part of for many more than a decade. And I was thinking that there has also never been a time for more "I told you so" moments from the privacy and digital rights community. And I think it is truly commendable that Cindy did not just make that the title of her book, "I Told You So," 30 years as a privacy defender. But yeah, no, jokes aside, I think that obviously isn't the most effective strategy. And today we want to really focus the conversation on lessons and insights that really ring loudest in this moment, and how we can seize this opportunity to redirect towards a better and more hopeful future. So with that, I'm going to turn to Cindy first. And, there's been a persisting binary between the idea that as citizens or as consumers, we kind of have to choose the lesser of two evils. It's either government surveillance or private surveillance. And, maybe we're just all better off hiding behind big tech to protect our privacy rights. But we have seen these distinctions collapse over the last decade and more. And so, at the risk of maybe a leading question, can you help us understand why this is unhelpful binary, and maybe what you see as the most concerning manifestations of when these two types of surveillance or power come together?
Yeah, I know, you're right. This is a question I used to get a lot. Like, are you more afraid of the companies or of the government? And I was like, nobody's giving you that choice. This is not a choice that anybody has put on the table. And I tell a bunch of stories in the book about post 9/11 surveillance technologies, technology effort, my God, post 9/11 surveillance. And none of them involve the government going to us as individuals and asking us for our phone records or our metadata or our internet communications. The government has always gone to our service providers in order to get information about us. What's different now is I think in two directions. One is there's a lot more people surveilling us, so there's a lot more places that they can get information that is, in some ways, a lot more granular about our lives. Um, and secondly, the government isn't just going and demanding it in the context of a subpoena or a massive order or something formal. They're actually buying it now. And the number one purchaser of information from the private data brokers now is the government. And FBI Director Kash Patel just testified in front of Congress a week or so ago that, yes, they are doing this, which was something they kind of lied about for a while or hid from us, and that they're going to continue to do it. So there isn't a distinction between the two. The information collected in the private context is being handed to the government. And I guess there's a third factor now, which is the government used to be pretty good at collecting information about us and pretty limited in its ability to use it. I mean, the NSA, kind of the higher parts of the government was pretty good at it, but now we're starting to see AI systems deployed at a much more local level with the ICE agents putting facial recognition on people's faces and using that, so they say, to create a database of people engaging in their First Amendment rights. AI is supercharging the ability of the government to use the data that it has and purchases in ways against us as individuals. So it's definitely, I felt a little, maybe not so much, I told you so, but a little like Cassandra for a long time, kind of seeing things that other people didn't quite see yet, although, of course, both the two of you are two of the other Cassandras in the room. But, and now I think it's becoming easier and easier for people to see that all of this spying is resulting in your neighbors getting swept up in ICE raids. All of this spying is being used to decide what price you pay for things. All of this spying is being used to do lots of things that are a lot more visible than they were when we first started. When I first started raising concerns about spying by the government and the companies.
I guess I think what you're making very clear is that the data surface area that is available to government is via, or for the most part, is via what companies are able to collect on us. But I guess I want to ask, as a matter of strategy, then there was a time when a lot of privacy and digital rights advocacy used to make appeals to the companies, like the era of Google don't be evil, to then defend against intrusions or excessive government interventions. And we have a handful of pretty high profile instances when companies have been our best shot at protecting our data. I guess I want to ask you, has your understanding of companies as are maybe not the only line of defense, but one line of defense changed, and what are the ways in which we can leverage that defense?
No, I think that they still are. It's always been occasional and not as consistent as we wanted it to be. But it's not a surprise to me that one of the two red lines that Anthropic drew about what services it was going to provide to the government was about domestic surveillance. We shouldn't have to depend on a tech CEO to protect our privacy, but in the absence of anybody else doing it, I will take it, and we will continue to hold these companies to high standards. And they've done some, again, we're pretty first in line when they do the wrong thing, but we also try to be really honest when they're not. When Apple said they weren't going to break the encryption on the iPhone, we were right there with them. When, Google was a leader in putting together very high standards for when they turn information over to the government, requiring warrants, giving notice, and things like that. So we give credit where credit is due. I think that the appetite for pushing back against this particular government is less than it was at the time, and we're trying to basically hold the companies to what they said they would do back before the Trump administration kind of became much more aggressive at pushing back on them. But I think that I don't think that it's one or the other. I think we have to push on both. And I think it's important to, call it as you see it, so that we give them a lot of criticism when they do the wrong thing, but we're not afraid to say when they're doing the right thing too, because people's privacy is in the mix. And that's the thing I care about. I don't care about whether I've said nice things about Google. I care about how many people are safer because Google did the right thing.
Yeah, and I want to come back both to the Anthropic Department of War situation, but also I think how we might take some of what you're saying, or the lessons from what you're saying, into this question of, how much government regulation do we want or need or require, particularly as in this moment people are calling for pretty expansive modes of oversight over the tech industry, and what does that mean for our rights? But I'll get to that in a second. I want to move to you, Kade. You've been at the kind of leading edge of progress in Massachusetts and doing that hard work of not just fighting the battles, but also picking the battles that feel most important to fight and that allow us to build the foundations for broader movement building. So I want to ask you, what have been, which are the fights that you have been leading? And also, I'm assuming those are the same. That's the same answer. But what do you see as the most potent fights of the current moment?
Sure. I mean, in politics, it's important to pick your battles carefully, right? And so, organizations like EFF and the ACLU have limited resources, and there are frankly not enough organizations that focus exclusively on digital rights issues in this country. And even though, some of you might be thinking, well, the ACLU is probably rolling in it compared to some organizations, we do a tremendous amount of other work as well. This is just a tiny part of the portfolio of civil rights and civil liberties issues that we take on. So we have to be really strategic about picking our battles, and the strategy is, it involves also determining what fights we think we can win. What coalitions can we build that are going to be able to create enough political power? And here in Massachusetts, I'm talking about at the state level, although, other organizations like EFF do this at the state level and at the federal level. My colleagues in Washington also, obviously at the ACLU, do this in DC. But here in Massachusetts, we're thinking, what are the issues that we could take to the state legislature, for example, that we feel like we could build a powerful enough coalition around to actually move some substantial law reform that is going to protect people in a measurable, significant, material way? And that's not always an easy question to answer when it comes to these more esoteric issues. Like when I talk to lawmakers, they're telling me that their constituents are calling them about healthcare costs and about the cost of living in a high cost of living state like Massachusetts. Even though, Amba, the issues that you raised at the beginning of this conversation are absolutely true, I think today more than ever, people are aware that digital privacy impacts them materially. But still, if you ask most working parents what they think about on a day-to-day basis and what really concerns them about their lives, it's not necessarily these issues at the top of the list. And so it is a tremendous political lift to get these issues in front of lawmakers in a way that is compelling and with a broad enough coalition of organizations that have the power to move something, and to move something past the objections of either the tech industry or law enforcement, which are typically the groups that oppose the legislation that I work on. And those are really influential organizations. So to more directly answer your question, in the past 5 or 6 years, we've really picked two primary campaigns at the state level in Massachusetts. One of them is facial recognition. This is something that we have worked very closely with EFF on here in Massachusetts and across the country, as well as numerous other, community organizations, religious groups, many other organizations, racial justice organizations. And essentially, when we picked that fight back in 2019, we were very strategic about the timing as well. We thought, okay, we're starting to see law enforcement agencies in Massachusetts and across the country use this powerful technology in criminal investigations. At the same time, there's not a lot of evidence that it works very well. It's completely unregulated. And there is evidence that there's significant racial and gender bias in the algorithms themselves that even further make problems for law enforcement who are generally not trained and don't necessarily know what they're doing with the technology. So we thought this is a perfect moment to build a movement and launch a campaign for law reform on this issue, because it's before every police department in Massachusetts has acquired the technology. Once you get to that point, it's actually really even more politically difficult to get lawmakers to step in, because the law enforcement lobby will effectively say, hey, wait a second, this is really important to us. We've been using this for years. At the same time, if you step in too soon and no police are using the technology, the lawmakers will say, oh, please come back to us later when this is a real issue. We're not seeing this. So we thought, okay, now's the time. Like, we're starting to see it, but it's not widespread. There are these important studies like the one that came out of MIT that Joy Buolamwini's group did on gender shades, looking at racial and gender bias and some of these algorithms. The National Institute for Standards and Technology put out this really key report in 2019 highlighting further racial and gender disparities in the algorithm. So we thought, all right, let's go for it. And we just so happened, timing is everything in politics, right? We just so happened to be introducing this a year before George Floyd was killed, and riots and protests erupted across Massachusetts and across the country, prompting lawmakers not only to take on police reform broadly, but to deal with facial recognition specifically. So that's one thing that we've worked on. We've been quite successful on that here in Massachusetts. And more recently, you mentioned Dobbs, Amba, about the abortion case. We knew that was coming in part because of the leak, but we also are not, fooling ourselves about the composition of this court and the long-term, Republican goal and Federalist Society goal of overturning the Roe decision. So we could see this coming down the pike, and we thought maybe there's an opportunity here in this crisis for us to make real for people a kind of nebulous concept that's been really difficult to communicate to lawmakers and even some coalition partners. And so we seized on that political crisis, turning it kind of into an opportunity for us here in Massachusetts, built a coalition around the specific issue of something that Cindy mentioned, location data brokers and the sale of our precise geolocation data to anybody who has the money to buy it, including the Attorney General of a state like Texas, who may want to investigate who's traveling from Texas to a state like Massachusetts to get an abortion, or any of the, self-motivated bounty hunters that are authorized by Texas statute to sue people under that law. So we thought, okay, this is a really clear example that we don't have to explain, that people get. People do not like the idea instinctively that any rich guy can buy information showing where they go, where they work, where they worship their religion, where they seek healthcare, where their children go during the day, when they're home, when they're not home. And that's exactly what this industry is facilitating. So we saw a window there and we seized on it. And so that has become the basis for a larger data privacy campaign that we are currently very much in the throes of. The state legislature here in Massachusetts has sort of gone halfway there. The state Senate passed a really good consumer privacy bill, and we're now working very closely with the House. So, in short, it's about sort of assessing the landscape, looking at the most dangerous issues that we see in the field, and then figuring out what we can do most strategically to, advance the law to provide the maximum protection for the maximum number of people.
Yeah, I think that there's a version of what you're talking about, which is sort of joining the dots between these high-level concerns that people kind of get but remain abstract to the most material ways in which they're manifesting, and just to get to actually move people, lawmakers, but also their constituents. And I think in the AI space, I've certainly, it seems now kind of uncontrovertible that the reason we have the political opportunity we have in this moment right now is because of data centers and surveillance pricing, like the kinds of issues that were affecting people most materially, affecting their pocketbooks, is what has eventually moved the ball, not the more sort of high level power analysis, as much as that has been sort of evident in some ways. So I think I just want to go back to what you said towards the end, right? Which is there are clearly some specific, narrow, bad use cases that are out there. There is evidence around them. And for the most part, I think with facial recognition, you would probably still have some folks that argue otherwise. But for the most part, they're like bad apples, and everyone can agree that this is the kind of data collection that shouldn't exist, and it's narrowly scoped so you can push that consensus through. But equally, it feels like that isn't, I mean, by definition, that isn't a future-proof strategy. And so we want to move towards, or in addition, we want rules of the road. And you mentioned that you've been pushing that legislation, more general data protection legislation in Massachusetts. I guess I wanted to ask you, do you see scope for, or do you think it's worthwhile to have these narrow, bright line rules be kind of within the scope of a broader omnibus data protection law? I know that is what the GDPR did, for example. They said there are some general rules of the road, and here's our laundry list of unacceptable risks. So I guess I'm trying to get at, do you think there's scope now that we're looking towards, to see what might be possible at the federal level for trying to do this in a more one-shot omnibus way? Or do you think it'll always be staged as kind of narrow first and then general later?
Well, honestly, we were really pleasantly surprised by the reaction of the Massachusetts legislature this session. The state Senate, leadership in the state Senate told us explicitly, we like the Location Shield Act, but we don't think it's enough. We want to do more. We want a comprehensive data privacy legislation, to pass. And so, that was the first time in my political career that lawmakers have ever said, you're not going far enough. And it was, music to our ears. So we have, adapted our strategy, obviously, and are now supporting broader consumer privacy legislation. That was always our policy preference, just to be clear. The issue was more about, how big of a bite was the legislature willing to take? And, also how could we most effectively mobilize a powerful coalition? And I'll just be totally honest with you. One of the key frameworks that we're advocating for in this omnibus data privacy legislation is a data minimization framework, which essentially says, companies should not collect more information than they need to provide you, the consumer, with the service that you've requested. Now, I had to say a lot of words that are very boring to explain that, and probably a lot of people's eyes glazed over in the middle of my sentence because it's a boring sentence, right? It's extremely important, but it's not super sexy. And, there's a famous quote from an architect in the 19th century who said, small plans don't move men's hearts. And I would also say super technocratic plans don't really move men's hearts either, right? So, that is a critical data privacy policy. We just didn't think that it was going to be something that we could, in the first instance, build a powerful coalition around, and then additionally, motivate constituents and lawmakers to support. So, we found that by focusing on this narrow issue of location data, we were able to build that huge coalition, attract lawmaker attention to the problem of commercial data brokers and data privacy generally. And then we found once they started digging around in it, they realized, wait a second, this is just one piece of the puzzle. If we really want to protect people, we have to go much bigger. So, in terms of the policy, there's no question that location data is just one piece. Biometric data is another very significant piece of sensitive data that needs to be protected. Frankly, all of our, browsing data and the information that companies collect about us needs to be protected. It was merely a strategic political choice for us to focus on location data first, because we thought, A, this is one of the most harmful pieces of data that technology companies are collecting about us and using without any sort of regulation. And B, it's the simplest one that we can communicate to a broad coalition of potential coalition members, lawmakers, constituents, to the media, to ordinary people.
Yeah, it's like it's important to have something we can all agree is a bad idea and then work from there. Okay, I'm gonna shift gears for a moment. We talked about, or sort of we mentioned Anthropic and that whole dust up with the Pentagon and the DoD briefly. And in some ways, it's many of the themes that we've already circled a little bit, which is we had a company that was at least ostensibly positioned as the good guy, even if I would argue the bar was really on the floor there, but really sort of standing publicly to defend against or to insist on protections against mass surveillance and autonomous weapons. And I think for many people, there was like a moment in the news cycle, and Cindy, I'm going to ask, come to you first, where I think people had a moment where they were like, wait, we're talking about the Pentagon and weaponry in ostensibly wartime context. Why is domestic mass surveillance part of the equation at all? So can you help us, I guess, unpack that first?
Well, it's hard to know, right? Because it's a classified system and we don't know what they were being asked to do or why. But, the NSA, the national security pieces of the US government, have been involved in mass surveillance domestically since 9/11. They did it in secret for a while. And then about 2005 or 2006, they were forced out into the open. And then in 2013 with Mr. Snowden, they were forced all the way out into the open, at least, well, I don't know about all the way because we still don't know what they're doing in secret. But so, the US military has had a role in domestic analysis. Or it's not the military really, it's more the NSA. So I don't know what the thing is. What I know is that the Department of Defense, I refuse to call it Department of War, said that they wanted the ability to do it, and Anthropic said no, that's one of our two red lines. And I think that so I think it would be really interesting to continue to push on this and try to figure out exactly what they wanted to do. It's not a surprise to me, kind of in general, but I don't know the specifics of what they wanted to do. What we know this government wants to do, though, in general, is they call it tearing down data silos, right? They want any information that the government gets access to, whether they purchase it or they get it through the normal processes like our IRS filings, to be available for them to use in any other situation they want. And we also know that they claim a lot of stuff that's domestic is actually national security. That's been some of the claims around some of the deportations, the Alien Enemies Act, other kinds of things. So they're inside blurring a lot of lines that used to protect us between military national security use and domestic use, between information gathered for one purpose being used for another purpose. So it's kind of not a surprise to me, given their lack of acknowledgement of these kinds of lines that protect our privacy, that the Department of Defense would demand the ability to use artificial intelligence tools to do domestic surveillance. But I don't know the specifics about that, and I think it will be important as time goes on for us to try to figure out exactly what it is they thought they wanted to do, because it looks like OpenAI said as long as it was legal, they would do it. And this is an important thing that I think sometimes is lost on people, and I just want to say it. I won't be lost on you guys, but for our audience, you know, having human rights gross human rights violations are often legal. Every genocide that has happened in the history of the world has been legal under the specific laws at the time. So it's really important that we hold companies and our government to a higher standard than what is legal. Legal is important, and I'm not saying it's not. Constitutional is important, but we know that those standards can be mutable over time. And that's why we have, in the aftermath of World War II, where some of the worst atrocities that mankind has seen were done under a legal regime that deemed them legal, that international human rights sets a standard for human rights that is higher than just what domestic laws are. So the trick in this Anthropic OpenAI thing is that Anthropic said, we're not going to engage in domestic surveillance. And OpenAI said, as long as it's legal, that'll be okay. And the thing about that is they want all of us to think that legal equals protective of human rights. And of course, that's not what history teaches us.
Can I just add a couple thoughts to that? So I completely agree with everything that you said, Cindy. And additionally, first, we're talking about the Trump administration here. So we should be clear about who we're talking about. We're not talking about a normal presidential administration. Even though the ACLU and EFF had significant issues with how the Obama administration, for example, handled these national security surveillance authorities, we're talking about an administration that daily flouts the rule of law, ignores the law whenever it feels like it, seems to believe that might equals right in every scenario, ranging from national security to domestic policy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the way that the national security establishment defines what is legal would really blow your mind. You should do some reading about how they stretch the definition of ordinary words that have common meanings to enable them to conduct surveillance, which in our view is blatantly unconstitutional. And then the third thing is, look at Sam Altman. For people who are curious about OpenAI, I would encourage you to read some really disturbing new reporting that the New Yorker published just yesterday by Ronan Farrow about Sam Altman and about allegations made by people who have known him throughout his life that he is a pathological liar. And that's not me talking. That is, many people who are quoted in this piece talking about how this man cannot be trusted and should not be trusted with the amount of power that he currently has.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it was, he has a someone described it very charitably as Sam Altman having a very convenient relationship with the truth. And I was just like, that's a euphemism if I ever heard one. I was also thinking that, we started by talking about how for many years there was this kind of general public understanding that privacy was potentially most valuable to anyone who had something to hide. It's interesting to note how that kind of pushback only succeeds if you kind of succeed at othering the person whose privacy is at stake. And I think with domestic mass surveillance at the heart of this national security dust up, it really did feel like it was much closer to home for every citizen. I think with the ICE uprising too, we saw how it became more difficult to make this about just, illegal immigrants, because you saw the ways in which the same surveillance apparatus was then turned on citizens as well, and people that were standing up for the rights of their neighbors. So I think for me, there's also a lesson there in some of these moments that really unify and break down that othering that I think some of the pushback.
I think that's right. And I think that another big moment like that was when the Dobbs decision came out, right? And Roe versus Wade was overturned. And suddenly there were a lot of people who thought perhaps maybe that this surveillance would never be turned on them, who suddenly realized that they could be on the back end of this surveillance as well. And of course, it got even more scary when, say, a mother and her daughter, a mother in Nebraska went to jail for having a Facebook Messenger conversation about an abortion that the daughter was seeking. So I think that one of the things that I try to say to people is, even if you think that this could never be turned on you right now, like the circumstances on the ground are changing pretty fast in ways that make it like not, it was a pretty entitled position to take a while ago, and now you should really not think that entitled position where you could never be on the back end of a bad governmental decision around surveillance, that would never happen to you. I think that the ground is shifting pretty fast now in ways that are easier for people to see. I mean, the big issue, and I think Kate's right about picking something that is visible and easy for people to see as kind of your first way in around privacy, because privacy protection itself can feel really, it's sneaky, right? Surveillance by definition is often sneaky. And so what that means is, for those of us who are concerned about it, it can be hard to connect the dots between surveillance and consequences in a way that, it's just not as hard to do with other kinds of problems in society. And so when those moments come up, when things kind of rise above the and are visible to people, I think, people like Kate and I, we're not really happy, but we try to take advantage of those moments when things are visible to try to push as much as we can, because it will go down again.
Yeah, that's right. And, I frequently throughout my career, prior to the second Trump administration and prior to Dobbs, people used to ask me all the time, why should I care? Sure, the cops are tracking my license plate, but I'm not doing anything wrong. What difference does it make? Or, I have nothing to hide. And I think increasingly people are not saying that anymore, because it's very evident that this information in the wrong hands can be and will be weaponized to hurt you or your family or someone you care about. A couple of examples. One of the most chilling things that I have witnessed, not personally, but seeing things online over the past couple of years in a period where there's been chilling things happening all the time, was when ICE agents in Minneapolis took pictures of protesters or observers, people who were following them around, and said their names, and then said, you're going to be removed from TSA PreCheck. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
And those people were actually removed from TSA PreCheck and had their, privileges revoked through TSA's like faster service or whatever. That is absolutely chilling. Those were people who were simply expressing their First Amendment right to watch and record federal law enforcement in the public performance of their duties. And facial recognition technology was weaponized against them to punish them directly for that First Amendment expression. So that's one example of how, even if you're not doing anything wrong, these technologies can be used to hurt you. The second thing is, we're seeing the Trump administration weaponizing social media surveillance tools to go after legal green card holders and other people who are lawfully present in the United States for their First Amendment protected speech. It is very important for US citizens to know in their hearts that what they do to immigrants, they will do to us. So do not for a second think that that sort of political, punishment of someone's political speech based on surveillance will only impact people who are non-citizens lawfully present in the United States. They will find a way to weaponize speech against US citizens as well. And then, the third example is more quotidian. It's related to local police license plate reader surveillance. We hear about these things all the time. Local police misusing their access to a local surveillance database. In this case, it was a license plate reader database through the Flock Corporation, to query 100 times in a short period of time his ex-girlfriend's license plate, and then track the guy that he was dating, because he was presumably upset that she had moved on. These are the less political, less kind of explosive, but much more frequent examples of how these surveillance technologies are weaponized against people. You may think, okay, I'm never going to, follow ICE in the streets, so that thing doesn't apply to me. I'm not going to post against the Trump administration online, so I'm not worried that, I'll be targeted. But do you date? Is it possible that you'll date someone who once dated a police officer, or that will be true for a family member or for a friend, or that you'll have a neighborly dispute with a cop who has access to all of these surveillance databases and can weaponize them against you to blackmail you? The reason that civil libertarians insist on checks and balances and the rule of law is because we know that information is power, and that without checks and balances, people with power will use that power to hurt us, and they will commit abuses and misuses of those databases. And the evidence for it is all over the place if you're interested in looking.
So, firstly, that was really compelling, and I think where you started, which is that I think more and more people are seeing themselves as potentially implicated. I think you're right that there's a kind of a universalizing of like who could be affected. It's coming for all of us. But there's also equally, I think, an overwhelm, because the laws are coming, but too slowly as they do. And so in the meantime, and this is a question we just got from the chat as well, and I feel like both of you could spend the next hour talking about this. But like, are there guides, toolkits, or other ways to orient to minimize one's digital exhaust? We started by saying this is not an individual question, but I also think it's important to acknowledge that there are individual there is something that we don't have zero agency even in this moment. And so what would you say to, or what do you say to people that ask you that pretty simple question, like, what can I do apart from using my voting power?
Well, don't underestimate the voting power. I think that so much of what we need to do right now, we can't do with individual choice. And I also really, I think we should push back on the idea that like this is your fault, or that your choices are the things that created this system. This is a rigged game. For most people, the apps, the tools, the services we need and that we have to rely on for our livelihoods, for our lives, are all rigged against us for privacy. However, we do have, EFF has a set of materials called Surveillance Self-Defense, ssd.eff.org, or just type in EFF Surveillance Self-Defense. And we have what we kind of call playlists, where depending on who you are and what your risk factors are, we suggest some things that you could try to do to help protect yourself. And the technologists call this threat modeling, but there's not a one size fits all. For privacy, you really have to think about yourself and what kind of risks you have. If you've got a green card, if you're going across a border, if you've got undocumented people in your life, if you're going to a protest, if you're a journalist, we try to provide various different playlists that help people make the set of decisions for themselves, and also think about the questions, people might want to, some people have a higher aptitude for risk. So that's a good good place for people to start. There are other people who have kits like this as well. Many of the kits you'll find on the internet use EFF stuff as a backdrop anyway. But we try to be kind of the source for training materials for a lot of other folks, but also make it directly available.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Cindy said. I agree that this is not a problem that ought to fall on us as individuals, and that we must use our political power in our democracy to fight for laws, enforceable laws, robust enforceable laws that protect our privacy, both from, the government and the police on the one hand, and from corporations on the other. And super strong supporter. I'm always pointing people to the surveillance self-defense tools that EFF provides on their website. I would offer that there are a couple of simple things that people can do. One of them is to use secure messaging technology. So the Signal app is free. Signal, like the phrase smoke signal. Signal is free and completely easy to use. If you've ever used WhatsApp or any other messaging technology, it'll be extremely native and easy for you to understand. You can download it on the Apple Store or on Google's Android store, and it facilitates secure end-to-end encrypted communications between you and any other person who has Signal installed on their phone. So I'd recommend using it to tell your wife to pick up milk at the grocery store. Don't just use these technologies to send information about protests or things of that nature. If you get into the habit of securing your communications when you're, talking about the local basketball team or whatever, you'll find that it becomes a habit. And I think that's probably the simplest and most important thing that most people could do.
And some
Then
people
additionally, if you live in Massachusetts, call your state rep and say that you want them to pass strong, comprehensive data privacy legislation. That is the other major thing that you should do.
What I was just saying was that if you took away from what Kate said, that Signal is a kind of unicorn that isn't going to sell your data or do bad things with it. I think it's also important to remember that Signal is a not-for-profit organization, and part of so much of the pathologies that we're seeing in the broader market come from I think misaligned incentives. And so I think there's a handful of signals. We need more of them, but equally I think we want to redirect to fix the incentives in the broader marketplace. And I think we're all aligned in that fight.
Yep.
Okay, so for the last segment, I want to get to for my sins, get to AI and how it does or doesn't relate to any of this. I think on the spectrum of everything has changed and everything is novel with AI to everything is actually depressingly familiar and we know exactly what to do. I definitely fall in the latter category. We need to make the move. Most of the tools we have in the books. And of course, it isn't an either or. But I wanted to ask you both, almost as a provocation, kind of where do you fall on that spectrum, and what do you think the right orientation or bridge building is between debates about privacy and debates about AI, with a huge caveat that I know that the two are related.
I mean, I would start by saying I do think there are ways in which AI supercharges the risks of surveillance. So this is why people are concerned about tools like Palantir, which provide an AI and central interface to data that's been collected in multiple ways. I think that the lack of ability to understand how neural networks, AIs, are making their decisions creates a set of risks for how we think about things like due process and, how do you challenge a decision that is made by an AI? How do you tell where that came from? Those are some of the building blocks of basic democratic rule and fairness to people, that when in the hands of the government making decisions anyway, it becomes harder and harder for people to challenge governmental decisions that are run through. And again, AI is a big term. So sometimes a neural network, for instance, where it's really difficult to tell how the technology came up with the decision that it came up with. Now, people are working on explainability and other kinds of things, but I don't think they're there yet. And they're certainly not available to real people, ordinary people who are trying to say, I want to challenge this decision about whether I get disability benefits or not. Tell me how this decision was made. So I think that AI supercharges some of the power of some of these systems. It also really makes it harder to think about how to challenge them. Certainly, the current legal and policy frameworks don't give us sufficient tools to be able to question decisions. And in fact, we've seen proposals out of the Trump administration that if a decision about, again, whether it's your benefits or unemployment or whether you get a mortgage that's backed by the government, which most people do, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac kinds of things, that you have even less ability to challenge it if it was made by an automated decision-making system. So we haven't caught up, and I think we actually have to even go further in terms of creating basic fairness. And this is all in the context of government use of these systems before you even get to the private use of these systems.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I mean, I would add a couple things. One, there are also unlawful discrimination issues to consider. The use of algorithms and AI to, inform or make decisions about key issues in our lives, like whether we will get access to housing or employment, or, how much our insurance will cost. Those are all areas that are already pretty tightly regulated by the government, and we have some really strong anti-discrimination protections in place. We can use those existing laws in the context of AI. I think the challenge with AI and, unlawful discrimination, for example, comes when an attorney general or some other, agent that's trying to enforce an anti-discrimination law tries to peek behind the curtain and see exactly how the unlawful discrimination unfolded. And so I think, what we're going to be interested in advocating for, and what other organizations that are like-minded are going to be asking state legislators and, eventually, if we have a functional Congress to do, is to require companies to do their own auditing, to look for unlawful discrimination, and then to keep those records so that when, an attorney general or someone alleging unlawful discrimination comes knocking, there's a paper trail to demonstrate, that the company's been doing due diligence, and that if they discovered a problem, they fixed it. That's sort of a simplistic way of describing the discrimination issues, but it makes me think of another issue, which is quite thorny, which is that, if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, we'd be talking about companies that provide bespoke machine learning tools to other businesses and to governments on a contract basis. And that was a challenge, but it was in some ways a more manageable challenge because there was a finite universe of algorithms out there and companies out there that were selling tools for these discrete purposes. What we're seeing now with the explosion of commercially available consumer-facing large language models is really challenging for enforcement because whether it's, an insurance broker that's, calculating someone's rate, or it's, someone who's evaluating job resumes because they're hiring for something, or it's someone who is, in a law enforcement organization using Chat GPT to write up their police report because they're lazy and they don't feel like doing it themselves. We're now entering a phase where it's not so much only that the institution, whether it be the police department or the insurance company or the housing agency, has contracted with a company to acquire a machine learning tool that's going to help them do their work more efficiently, or so they say. It's individual employees, maybe freelancing, right? Using these tools on the side without maybe authorization from their bosses or from the organization. And, that's one issue. And the other issue is that these companies change their models all the time, and they do so in ways that are not transparent to the public. So, if I even discover the fact that a police officer used Chat GPT to write up the police report when I was arrested, which, maybe I'll never find that out. But if I do happen to learn that in a deposition or something, can I go to ChatGPT and say, tell me about the model that was used at the time when this person, conducted this search or entered this prompt and got this result? And, it's very unclear what courts are going to say about whether defendants will have access to that type of information, and whether ChatGPT will even say, listen, we don't have that information. That was 5 models ago. That was 3 years ago. Litigation can take a while. So anyway, these are some of the thornier questions that we in the advocacy community are starting to explore, and they're not simple. But I want to say one last thing about AI and our democracy, which is that, Mark Andreessen and the Silicon Valley billionaires that got behind Trump, like Elon Musk, they've made a bet, a very clear bet, that authoritarianism is better for the tech industry than democracy. And I think we all need to be really clear-eyed about the stakes of that bet that they've made, and we all need to prove them wrong. And the good news is that we can, because Mark Andreessen might have billions of dollars, but he only has one vote. So, I would encourage you, when you think about these issues, to not despair and to not think, oh, the tech industry has so much power, their tentacles are in everything, there's no way we're going to be able to, walk this back. That's nonsense. When I was a kid, we had no gay rights in this country. It was unfathomable to me to imagine that I would be able to get married. And here I am, in my mid-40s, married to the woman I love. Things can change radically in a short amount of time. And the thing that changed that was people power. People made that happen. So, we can overcome the industry's objections to our democracy. We can overcome their objections to our regulation of the industry. It's going to take a lot of work, but it is imminently possible.
Cindy, what is giving you the most hope in this moment, as maybe the last word?
I mean, honestly, Kate just gave me a ton of hope. That was that was like a mic drop speech. That was so great. But I mean, I think that it is that people are showing up and they're recognizing that this is something that they need to do. They're not just sitting back anymore. It's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to try to recruit more people into thinking that ordinary people have the power to devote their lives to this kind of work. I think that it's important that people who do this kind of work are not just there's some people who can only volunteer, and that's really important, but having a professional class of people who are standing up for civil liberties and doing civil society is really important, and something that even the people who can't do it should support, because we work for you. And I think that's part of why I wrote the book, was in order to try to make it seem like this was doable for, the next generation of people. I was kind of writing to a young Cindy and thinking, what book might she want to read in order to do this? So that's part of why I wrote it the way I wrote it. I think that we are really seeing a lot of people stepping up and realizing that, very famously at when the Constitution was passed, somebody asked Ben Franklin, did you go with a republic or a monarchy? And he said, a republic if you can keep it, right? We're in the if you can keep it time. But what makes me hopeful is I'm seeing people show up. We're seeing people stand up for their neighbors. We're seeing people say, like, it's just not okay. And there's a lot of work between here and there. We didn't get into this situation like overnight or just because of one thing. But we're starting to see people push ahead. I think that's what gives me hope. That and dogs.
Yes, touching grass feels important for all the reasons in this moment. Okay, I'm going to hand it to Frederica. This was an incredible conversation. Thank you both so much.
Oh, thank you. This was really fun.
Yes, thank you very much, Bakak, for moderating this conversation. And thank you to our panelists, Kade Crockford and Cindy Cohn, for the gift of your time and your expertise. Thank you for being with us. Have a good night.